Hello, I think we're going to get started here. Um, Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Gina Borromeo, and I am the Senior Director of Collections and Curatorial Affairs here at the Walters Art Museum. Thank you all for coming to today's Boshell lecture, Ancient Egyptian Sekhmet Statues and the Temple of Mut. As an integral part of the Walters' work to expand understanding of the histories of people and objects that we steward, and in order to create broader awareness of the histories that have led us to the present moment, I will begin this program by reading our Indigenous Land and Cultural Heritage Acknowledgement. The Walters Art Museum acknowledges the Piscataway and Susquehannock nations that originally inhabited this land. We also acknowledge tribal nations, most notably the Lumbee, who migrated here, and indigenous peoples whose ancestors are represented in the objects we steward in our collection. Today's program, Ancient Egyptian Sekhmet Statues and Temple of Mut, is part of our Boshell lecture series. Since 2017, the museum's Boshell lecture series has brought internationally recognized authors, archaeologists, and historians to present free lectures on a wide variety of topics related to the museum's collection, with a particular focus on the art, culture, and people of the ancient world. On behalf of our staff and Board of Trustees, please join me in thanking the Boshell Foundation, some members of whom are with us this afternoon, for their generous support. Now I have the honor of introducing our esteemed guest speaker, Dr. Betsy Bryan, who will speak about these monumental statues of the Egyptian lion-headed goddess Sekhmet and their excavation. These statues have been on loan to the Walters from the British Museum for over 20 years and will soon be returning to London. Before we say farewell to these magnificent statues, we felt it was the perfect time to invite Dr. Bryan to give us insight into their original contexts. Dr. Betsy Bryan has been the director of the Temple of Mut at Karnak excavations from 2000 to 2020, where the Sekhmet statues are believed to be from. Dr. Bryan has been working with an interdisciplinary team of archaeologists, surveyors, geophysical experts, osteologists, and ceramicists to publish 2 decades of work at the site. Dr. Bryan's research is focused on the organization and production of art and its social and cultural meanings, as well as Egyptian ritual, particularly its performance and material expressions. She is the Alexander Badawy Emerita Professor of Egyptian Art and Archaeology at Johns Hopkins University, and a specialist in the New Kingdom with literary and historical interests from the Old Kingdom through the Coptic era. Following Dr. Bryan's talk, we will hear a presentation about the specific statues currently on view here from Chelsea Kaufman, a PhD candidate in Egyptian art and archaeology at Johns Hopkins University. Chelsea has a background in studio art, art history, and archaeology. Her current research focuses on representations of the domestic dog in ancient Egypt. Following Chelsea's presentation, we will have a Q&A moderated by our very own Dr. Lisa Anderson-Zhu, Associate Curator of Art of the Ancient Mediterranean here at the Walters. And we will cap off the event with a reception in the lobby on level 1. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Bryan to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you, Gina, and thank you very much for this invitation. I was pleased and delighted to have been involved in the last installation of the Egyptian collection when the Sekhmets came. So it will be sad to see them go, but we'll give them a wave as they leave. So I'm going to talk to you for a few minutes about the source of these Sekhmet statues, or the most probable source, which is the Temple of the goddess Mut in South Karnak. And it is a site that, as we've just heard, I've been working at since 2001. I'm happy to say that my co-director, Violaine Chauvet, is now sort of taking over, excuse me, and I'm continuing because we have so much to publish. But one of the things you'll notice right away is that the Mut Temple is located actually with a lake that surrounds it on three sides. And that is a unique feature to this particular site, this crescentic-shaped lake, and I will return to that in a moment. But it's important to note that the goddess Mut has a name, which is the Lady of Isharu. And Isharu is, in fact, the name of the lake. So when we talk about this goddess, she's, again, unique in the sense that her place is a lake and not necessarily only identified with a temple. Okay. Now these are the two statues that Chelsea will be talking to you about that are on view in the gallery. But I want to start with them because they are the reason why I've been asked to speak to you today. Of course, we don't know with certainty where they originally were, but almost certainly they did derive from the temple of the goddess Mut. This is an aerial view of that temple. As you can see, sadly, the walls have been taken away over long periods of time by those who have used the temple as a quarry. And that is a very common phenomenon in Egypt. And so sadly, we really don't have a great deal of representative scenes left on the walls because most of our walls are actually down to foundation levels. But it doesn't mean there's nothing to find, because as in most cases in Egyptian sites, if you actually dig beneath a structure, you will find that it was sited on an earlier one, and you will find the remains of that underneath it. And that was actually the case with us as well. Now, I just want to point out where most of these Sekhmets were found and where they still are. You can probably see for yourself that this is what we call the first court. There are still many of them still there. The second court, likewise, we have them against the walls, and here, here, and here. And we also have a group of them that go, you can see them here. They start back, and originally they also existed here on the eastern side of the temple. So the Sekhmets, as found by the European expeditions who visited as early as the mid-18th century, certainly found hundreds of Sekhmets on the site, and primarily in the order in which I've noted them. So in fact, as I say, they have been known since the 18th century. And as you will see for yourselves, the condition that most of them are in that are left on the site is not particularly healthy. Many of them do not have heads anymore. The ones that do have heads are quite eroded. And in fact, already in 1875, when Auguste Mariette was the head of the Antiquities Service, he complained bitterly that when he went there, the British, the French, and the Italians had looted so many that he had difficulty getting any that he found appealing. So in fact, this is what Mariette has to say about it, that he says that in his view, one would find no less than 374 in that first court, 50 in the second, and some 75 in each of the corridors on the east and the west sides of the temple proper. He thus made a suggestion that originally there were about 572 of these Sekhmet statues, each one of which is in the range of 6 to 8 feet in height and a solid piece of gray granite or granodiorite. Now, we really don't know how many originally existed. In fact, the numbers have continually grown in the years since Mariette first commented on it. But here is the complaint that Mariette actually made about his work at the temple, and he put it in a footnote, interestingly enough, at the bottom of his page, and he says that these have been exploited since 1760. And then he says that they're very mutilated, that those that remain, I've hardly succeeded in discovering one of them passable for the Museum of Bulaq, which was the Egyptian museum at that time in Cairo. So here in the Description de l'Égypte, which was published right around the turn of 1800, you do see drawings were made of a number of these Sekhmet statues. And all of these, by the way, are known statues to have come from the Mut Temple. This one in particular is in the British Museum. Now, in the late 19th century, the Mut Temple was actually excavated by 2 women. A very unusual situation then and up until fairly recently. These women, Margaret Benson and Janet Gourlay, spent 2 years. Gourlay actually went back for a third, but Benson became quite ill to work at the Temple of Mut. And in fact, the book that they produced in the aftermath of this is still full of an enormous amount of material that was found at the site. And among it were the discovery of very large scale Sekhmet statues. They almost certainly stood in front of the large gateways called pylon. The head here that you see of the large, what they called Sekhet, we now know to be Sekhmet, actually was removed into the Egyptian Museum many years ago. But there is at least one large-scale statue in more or less good preservation, which remains on the site. So who was the goddess Mut, and who was the goddess Sekhmet? Now, it's a little complicated, but the fact of the matter is that in the 18th dynasty, the time period that the Sekhmets were made, they were all fashioned somewhere around 1370 BCE, and that was in the reign of King Amenhotep III. But at that time, this goddess at the Mut Temple was not simply called Mut, nor was she simply called Sekhmet, but the inscriptions that we have on the material that we have both excavated and found on site refer to her as Mut Bastet Sekhmet, all 3 names, and then referred to by a singular pronoun. So Mut Bastet Sekhmet, she did such and such. And so that is how we understand entirely that all 3 of these deities are in fact bound together as one and have the potential for acting as any and all of them did. So in fact, Mut as Sekhmet is in fact a daughter of the sun god. As such, she is an agent of the sun god and can act to protect him. That is the primary role of the goddess Mut, as well as the goddess Sekhmet, and even Bastet as well. Now, at our site, we also have her being very particularly associated with the crescentic lake, which is indeed lunar in type And she is, in that sense, very much associated with a lunar goddess, Tefnut, who is a lioness goddess, and her role is seen in a variety of myths associated with both of these goddesses. And at the same time, they are all connected to the really primary daughter of the sun god, Hathor. All of them are aspects of the goddess Hathor, whom you see here with her cow ears. Now, if we consider that there are several different myths, two in particular, that are associated with the goddess Sekhmet and Mut as it happens, one of them is the story of the myth of the sun's eye. Now, in the story of the myth of the sun's eye, Tefnut, the lioness, has left Egypt and must be enticed to return, whether it be from the south in Nubia or from the east-south, one or the other. And here you see the god Thoth as a dog ape in his role of propitiating her and enticing Tefnut back into Egypt. Now, if you go down to Sudan and you visit the temple of Amenhotep III's wife, Queen T, at Sedinga, you will actually see Queen T in the role of Tefnut with a lioness body, but her human head on top. And you'll notice again the cow-headed figures of Hathor to make sure we understand her connection. So actually, in Nubia, we have Queen T as the goddess Tefnut, her husband as a sort of form of the sun god himself, coming back to be enticed to come back to Egypt. Now, the other myth that is extremely well known as associated with Sekhmet is the Book of the Heavenly Cow, and it is often called the destruction of mankind. Now, in that myth, which is very associated with our particular work at the Temple of the Goddess Mut, we find that the sun god has become very unhappy with mankind, who are not treating him as he would like with respect. And he decides to call his daughter Hathor, the cow, and he turns her into the lioness and calls her Sekhmet. And he sends Sekhmet down into Egypt to kill mankind and punish them for their rebellion. And Sekhmet, that's exactly what she's made to do. So she begins running up and down the wadis and the valleys of Upper Egypt, killing mankind and becoming, as she does, completely obsessed with blood. She develops a bloodthirst. After a time, the sun god Re relents and changes his mind. He doesn't want all of mankind to disappear, but when he tells Sekhmet to stop, she doesn't. So the plot is made, together with the help of a number of gods who advised him, to drown the fields of Upper Egypt with beer that has been dyed with red dye. And Sekhmet sees it and is attracted to it because she thinks it's blood. She drinks all of the beer, becomes completely drunk, and passes out. And mankind is saved. Now, oddly enough, this actually has a material form that we have discovered and been lucky enough to excavate at the Temple of the Goddess Mut, where when we excavated underneath the porch itself, we found a series of blocks, and behind them, a series of column drums. And when we removed all this material, now you can see many more of these column drums, it turned out that we had 12 of them, and on 6 of them, there is an inscription that refers to, she made it as a monument for her mother Mut, the mistress of Isharu, making for her a columned porch of drunkenness anew. So what we have found is the actual location of the Porch of Drunkenness where the rituals, the festival of drunkenness, was celebrated in the reign of Queen Hatshepsut in the 15th century BC. It was eventually taken down, probably in the time of Thutmose III, but the festival itself continued to be celebrated. Now, in the time that's gone by, we have taken the column drums and had them re-erected, mostly to sort of give our sense of self a little bit of height that is available. And so we now know sort of what the height of that temple was. These are not where they originally stood. In fact, we think that the Porch of Drunkenness was probably over here on this side of the temple. But now let's think about how this, what happens on the festivals of drunkenness. In this particular time, we have a very alcohol-fueled festival where drugs were mixed together with beer or wine. And there are actually two different festivals of drunkenness that took place in Thebes in the New Kingdom during the year. The first is called the actual Festival of Drunkenness. The second is called the Beautiful Feast of the Valley. And at the time of the Beautiful Feast of the Valley, the people of Thebes would actually start at the Temple of Mut, but then they would cross the river and visit their ancestors in their tombs and have banquets with them in their tombs and essentially become drunk with them. So that festival took place first in this second courtyard, which is right in front of the temple that Hatshepsut and Thutmose III built together. And later, this first court was added. You can see that it's much larger. So the crowds for the festivals were becoming greater and greater. And it started just at dusk. The lamps were lighted, and as the lamps were lighted, people were passed out beer. Sometimes beer that was tinted red. And as the night went on, they drank and ate very little. And by the time midnight came, most everyone had passed out. And that was intentional. There was a moment in which everyone is supposed to be out cold. And then a little while later, maybe an hour or two later, drummers came into the temple drumming with loud, loud beating noises. You can imagine how that felt on their heads at that point. And they awakened. And as they are awakened, the statue of the goddess Sekhmet is carried into their presence. And when that happens, the master of ceremonies addresses the goddess and asks her for a request on behalf of the people. Now, during the time of the Beautiful Feast of the Valley, or the New Year festival when it was outside of Thebes, we also have people gathering with their family members in the tombs. And when they do, they drink to enormous excess. And they are, when we see them here, we have them talking to one another. And some people don't want to drink because they think there's something wrong with it. But most of them, like this lady, says, drink it up and pass the cup to me. So at this point, we are finding that the drunkenness festival is a means for the goddess Sekhmet's rituals associated with the punishment of mankind and the saving of mankind to be celebrated. And here's a scene from a tomb where you actually have the people gathering for the beautiful feast, and the musicians are playing music, and above them we actually have the words of the song that they're singing. And towards the end of it, it comes to say, Mut has come as the glowing one of the beautiful face in order to cause her sistrum players to cry out, desiring drunkenness from a goblet of gold. Now, at the moment of making a request to the goddess, after everyone has passed out and been brought back by the drummers, we have the master of ceremonies actually making a request. And on this particular statue, dedicated in the Mut temple by the high priest of Amun, we have one such request, a very interesting one, because most of them did have to do with either wanting the gods to love the king, and particularly Hathor, but also for the gods to make sure that the enemies of the king were punished. And on this statue, it says on the back, "O Sekhmet, may you be powerful of heart, be powerful indeed over those who hate her." And the her, in this case, was Queen Hatshepsut, who may very well have had quite a few people to be concerned about. So 100 years after the time of Hatshepsut, Amenhotep III is on the throne. He begins, towards the beginning of his third decade of rule, to fill the Mut temple with statues of the goddess Sekhmet everywhere. So why is that? In fact, Sekhmet was not simply the agent of the sun god who would punish evildoers on behalf of the sun god, but she was also the one who protected the world and time itself. She made sure, on behalf of the sun god, that his creation was safe, that each year the flood would rise, that there would be fields and agriculture taking place. And if the enemies took over, she would bring pestilence, disease to kill those who were opposed to the sun god. So when the 30th year is rolling around, the king is going to celebrate his rejuvenation festival called the Sed Festival. By now, Amenhotep III is getting to be old. He needs to be rejuvenated if he is going to continue to rule. So he begins to have statues made that represent this goddess who can guarantee the safety and protection not only of these temples, but of the king in the year in which he is to become rejuvenated. So he fills the Mut temple, who is, of course, Sekhmet, with these statues, and he also fills his own funerary temple with them. In the tomb of the person who ran the harem during this time period, Keruef, we see the king seated, and behind him is the goddess Hathor, and behind Hathor is Queen Ti, both of whom are acting to support and protect the king in this time. And the text says, "Proceed, O Majesty, to the place which you desire. Her wrath," meaning Sekhmet's, "has no place. O my mistress," invoking Hathor, "come and protect Nebmat-Re," that is the king. As I said, he also filled his funerary temple with these statues. He created the safest possible environment in which he could then celebrate all of the rituals associated with his rejuvenation. And for him it worked, because he ended up celebrating 3 of these before he passed away late in his 38th year of rule. Now, if we look really closely at Sekhmet, you will see exactly what he intended when he made these statues. The ones we have here may not show this, but the eyes are actually painted red. Red for the blood and the anger that Sekhmet would bring in the case that her enemies rebelled. But the form that they made the goddess in here shows her not angry, but holding the sign of life in the direction of the king. So she is appeased and propitiated, and that is how she was represented and placed in these temples. Now, at this point, we can account for more than 1,000 of these statues. How many more there were, I really don't know. But the two that are here are fine representations of exactly what that is. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bryan, for that. So I would like to turn our attention now to two statues that are in the Walters. Here they are in the gallery. They've been on loan here from the British Museum since 2001, and they're set soon to return to the British Museum, who has the largest collection of these statues outside of Egypt. They have 39 both complete and fragmentary statues, 11 of which are seated, of the type that you see here. In general, as Dr. Bryan mentioned, these statues come from the Temple of Mut. They also come from the mortuary temple of Amenhotep III, located on the west bank of the Nile. They seem to have been made for his said festival, marking his 30 years of rule, and they were designed to rejuvenate the king in this festival. When found, they've been densely arranged. As Dr. Bryan mentioned, when Mariette was excavating, he originally thought there may have been 572 of these statues in the Mut Temple alone. He didn't consider the numerous others found now in the mortuary temple. The epithets on these statues come from the litany to Sekhmet. They link the goddess with the decans of the southern sky. As you can see here, the statues are made of granodiorite, which is a hard stone, an igneous rock, which generally will come from the quarries in Aswan. These quarries were used from the 5th dynasty onward, and they take on a special significance in the 18th and 19th dynasties. They could have been cut using hammer stones and an open-cut quarry, and then rolled onto a barge and shipped north. The black color is significant for the said festival symbolism. So the black in Egypt refers to fertility and regeneration, which would have been entirely appropriate for the said festival. The general design of these statues is all very similar. The seated statues tend to have a solar disk headdress with a uraeus on the front. This one is missing that uraeus. They have an ankh in their left hand, and this combined symbolism refers to the solar associations of the goddess as the Eye of Ra and her ability to give life to the king. Upon a closer look, we see that the statues have a woman's wig beneath the mane of a lion, which is shown much shorter than that of a male lion. She has a wesek broad collar between the straps of her dress and between her hair. Her dress is a simple sheath dress. It's conservative for this time period and often worn by goddesses as well as royal women. And on her face, we see her stylized whiskers, which appear as petals and complement the rosettes on the breasts on her dress. Looking more closely at the statues individually, I'd like to start with this one here, which has an interesting acquisition story. It was probably captured at sea in 1801 during the War of the Second Coalition, which took place between 1798 and 1802. As Dr. Bryan mentioned, the French excavated at Mut between 1798 and 1801, where they found numerous Sekhmet statues. 15 of the statues that the British confiscated from the French then ended up in the British Museum were recorded, and only one was described as lacking a solar disk and uraeus. So likely this one did come from Mut. It's considerably damaged, as well as many others that the French excavated, and it was restored in 1999. Its hands as well as its ankh were restored, and its forehead was entirely rebuilt with resins. It's very difficult to see in this image, but you should definitely take a closer look in the gallery. Onto its throne, we see that it's a simple block form with a low backrest. On the side, we have the Semitawi motif. The Semitawi motif is comprised of an entwined lotus and papyrus plant around a central windpipe, which can be read phonetically as Sema, the Egyptian word to unite. This sign takes place within the Hut or temple hieroglyph, and together this can be understood as the king's sovereignty over a unified Egypt. The front of the statue is inscribed. All Sekhmet statues that are dated to the reign of Amenhotep III follow a very similar pattern. First, the king is named, either his throne or his birth name, followed by the phrase beloved of Sekhmet, and then finally a unique epithet of the goddess. We know of 109 unique epithets from these statues alone. On your left, in the green, we can read, Perfect God, Lord of Joy, Lord of the Two Lands, Nebmat Ra, Beloved of Sekhmet, Lady of Saharet, who may give life. And on the right, in the purple, we see Beloved Son of Ra, of his body, Amenhotep, ruler of Thebes, Beloved of Sekhmet, Lady of Saharet, who may give life. And after seeing the ankh that she holds towards the king, we can see this is nicely complemented in the phrase, she may give life. Of the 109 epithets that I mentioned, only 20 ascribe the goddess to a specific town, of which this is one, Saharet. Many of these towns are no longer known to us, and that includes this town. But it's possible that it was commissioned for the temple by the town of Saharet. If we look closer at this inscription, we see that the name of Amenhotep has been hacked out and restored. It's only faintly visible. That's here in his cartouche. So some of you may know that Amenhotep's son and heir, Akhenaten, set out in his 8th regnal year to remove the name of Amen and the representations of Amen, and he did not spare his father's name. It was subsequently restored in a later period. Now our second statue can be easily differentiated by the presence of the solar headdress, which the first lacked. The headdress represents an antique repair of the statue, although it is still missing its uraeus and is not entirely complete. This statue's acquisition is somewhat different than the first. We know that the British Museum purchased a collection of these statues from Henry Salt in 1823 for £2,000. So while we know this is from Henry Salt's collection, he hired more than one archaeologist. Initially, he hires Giovanni Belzoni, the famous strongman, who works for him between 1816 and 1817. He excavates on the western side of the Temple of Mut, opposite the French, who excavated 15 years earlier and whose objects were captured by the British. So he finds more than 40 of these Sekhmet statues before having a falling out with Salt, who proceeds to hire Yanni Athanasi between 1817 and 1818. He excavates both at Karnak and at the mortuary temple, and when the collection is put together for the British Museum, it's never indicated where each of these statues came from. So it's possible that it did come from the mortuary temple. This statue is also inscribed. You can see on your left, or the statue's proper right, it reads, Perfect God, Lord of the Two Lands, Hej Kepera Setaben Ra. And on your right, it reads, Son of Ra, Lord of Crowns, Sheshank, Beloved of Amun. So this is not the same king. This is the biblical Sheshak of the 22nd dynasty. But the statue is 18th dynasty in style. Oops. So we know that Sheshank, in his reign, had ambitions of restoring centralized royal control over Egypt. He set out to reject political fragmentation of the previous dynasty. And when we look at the side of his throne and we look at the Samatawi motif, we see that he is expressing what Amenhotep III expressed, his control over a unified Egypt. But now that it's been reinscribed for Shashank, it is taking on a new meaning in the Third Intermediate Period. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. That was absolutely fascinating. These statues have been such an important part of the galleries for the last 20 years. And so I feel like we've actually missed out a little bit by not having this context shared before. Like, that's just amazing. I will answer a question that has not yet been asked. Are we going to replace them with anything? At the moment, no. So it's something that we're going to take some time to think about. There aren't other large-scale sculptures from Egypt in the United States available at the moment, and we don't want to borrow from abroad again. So for now, that space will be empty, but perhaps we'll find something else or move forward with a new installation and a new way to display the Egyptian art. So that said, if anybody has questions, please raise your hands, and we'll bring microphones around so that people can hear your questions. You can see some hands. I see your hands. There's some over here.
Do they know, well, the igneous rock granodiorite's pretty hard. I wouldn't think it would weather out that much. Is the weathering of the statues due to natural causes, or were they destroyed? Does anybody have a note know about that?
I think it's clearly at the Mut Temple a combination of things. A lot of them have been deliberately cut. Yeah, a lot of them have been deliberately chopped up. Sometimes that was being done because someone decided that the socle that they stood on looked awfully good for something they had in mind to make. And so you find that that's the case. Also, obviously, once the Westerners started coming in and found them attractive, they didn't want to necessarily take the entire statue, so they would take the head. And so a lot of museums, I'm sure you've noticed, have heads and not whole bodies. But the other issue is actual erosion. So in the Mut Temple, as you saw on the slides, is surrounded. It's on a peninsula surrounded by a lake. And the groundwater is very high. And that groundwater seeps into granite. And I think anyone who knows granitic stone knows that once it's lost its surface, it's lost its surface. You can't do anything about it. And so the kind of damage we see results from a statue which has fallen over and been lying against the wet ground, and it loses that nice polished surface, and it's a sad thing to see, but it then oftentimes literally turns into dust, to granitic dust.
I was wondering what's prompted the British Museum to ask for the statues to be returned.
That is a question that we were just talking about earlier. We don't actually, they didn't justify why they want, they belong to them. They didn't say that they had a particular project in mind. They know that we love them and that we wanted to keep them, and they told us that they know that, but they still asked for them back, but without saying if there will be a broader project at the British Museum. I mean, I have a question why people are, oh, no, there's one right there.
This is slightly off course, but given the Temple of Mut was the Lady of the Lake, was that the inspiration for the Arthurian legend of the Lady Lake?
I doubt that. It sounds wonderful, but no, I don't think so.
And one other quick question. Given the pronunciation, were the worshippers of Mut, did they go to Canada instead of the United States? Because we would have said but.
That's good.
Is the blood festival still celebrated?
Is the drunkenness festival still celebrated? Probably only in fraternities.
I'm wondering, is there another type of statue where there are so many? Like the way you've described what Amenhotep III was doing and why he wanted so many, and the kind of event there that, you know, the spectacle that seems really overwhelming and amazing. But I'm wondering, are there other statues of other deities where we see thousands possibly?
Yeah, it's a great point. I'd like to hear what Chelsea says about that also.
No, I don't believe at this scale that we have anybody like this, any deity represented this way.
Two questions. One of them is, how did they do the carving? And I noticed how incredibly symmetrical the carving is. I'm wondering how they did that. And I was also wondering if there was any place else that Sekhmet showed up in such quantities, or even one or two, if they were someplace else as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure both of us could comment on the topic of how they're worked. But it's definitely a series of stages. So when you start with a block of quartz, of granodiorite, or even granite, the first thing that has to be done is they work it with a hammer and a rock hammer. So a wooden mallet hitting a rock hammer in order to get the rough shaping. Once they get it to the point where they really are going to put features on it, then it's a really difficult combination of using both stone chisels and bronze chisels. There's actually an area which is just granodiorite debitage, just piles, like 10 feet high piles of just what's left over. So we knew that what they did is they would rough out a statue in the Aswan quarry and then put it on a boat and bring it to Thebes and do the finishing work there, but no one's ever found an actual site where that was being done. So this is actually pretty cool stuff. Oh, what was the other question? Do you want to say anything? I actually think that we do have a few that have been found in a variety of sites in Egypt. Even in Karnak, you can find, there are 3 or 4 or 5 of them, but I don't think there's anywhere else that they were being made for.
Are all lion-headed goddesses or lion-headed deities Sekhmet? Bastet, we have a number of bronze Bastets. And as soon as you said that it's Mut, Bastet, Sekhmet, I thought, oh, that's really confusing to me as somebody who's not a specialist. And then I know of other lion-headed deities that aren't called Sekhmets, and I just wonder if if you could expound a little bit on that.
Yeah, it is confusing, but it's also exactly the way the Egyptians understood the divine world, that there is an essence that goes through all deities, and you give it a name in order to invoke it for you and your situation. So yes, indeed, there are other lion-headed deities who have many of the same aspects that Sekhmet has. And Rayet Tawi is one very nearby in the Temple of Mut, just a few kilometers away. They're at the Temple of Mut, where Rayet Tawi is the goddess. The actual hymn for the Festival of Drunkenness is inscribed on the walls. So the same festival is going on there. It's just that in different locations, people are giving this set of roles that the goddess played a different name.
So I was wondering about whether or not how prolific were representations of Sekhmet prior to the creation of the Temple of Mut? Does it kind of ignite this style of sculptural representation of Sekhmet? It sounds like you're only seeing it in there, but can you elaborate a little bit?
Do you want to talk about that?
So we do see Sekhmet represented long before this. It's the statuary form that you point out, which is absolutely less common. This is a style that comes out in Amenhotep III's reign, but she is represented on two-dimensional surfaces.
Two questions. Will this be recorded by chance? And the second question had to do with the ceremony of drunkenness and evoking. I was wondering, when they were partaking in the ceremony, were they drawing down the spirit of Sekhmet, or were they using the statue to project their wish upon the statue?
Okay, I can take that one. What was the first one? Did you?
It'll be recorded.
Okay, thank you.
What was the first question?
If it's recorded.
Oh, was it recorded? Okay, sorry. Okay, yeah. So on the topic of the festival itself, I think what you're asking is how they reacted and related to the statue of the goddess and what that connection was. So in their understanding, at least our interpretation of the textual material associated, at the moment of this awakening and bringing the image of the goddess into the midst of the participants, it is what we might consider an epiphany. At that moment, they actually experience a direct connection to the goddess, and they assume that the goddess has created a direct connection to them. And that is why it is followed by an actual appeal to the goddess to do something for them, because they've got a phone connection at that moment. Better use it.
I'm kind of curious about the field of Egyptology, and I'm wondering about the centers. I know there's University of Chicago, Berkeley, and Hopkins, and I was just wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that, about what kind of activity and who's doing what activity.
I'll let you answer additional. So there are about 7 or 8 centers for Egyptology in North America, so UCLA, Toronto, at the Institute of Fine Arts in New York, Yale, Harvard, Penn, all of them, and are active. Most of them do archaeology. And they are working at different places. We are working in Thebes at Penn. They're working in the great city of Abydos, which is the home of the god Osiris. And in Harvard, their devotion is largely to Giza, where the Great Pyramids are. At Yale, they have worked in a variety of sites in southern Egypt doing surveys of a variety of things. And let's see, Berkeley has been working in sort of Middle Egypt when they're out there. So we actually are fortunate in sort of covering a lot of territory by even a small number of centers. Did you have anything you want to add?
I have a question, Chelsea. When you were talking about how the British Museum acquired these two statues, I found that very fascinating, especially captured at sea. Like, that just boggles my mind. And I wondered if, do you know, are there other interesting stories like that of some of the other statues?
Yeah, so one of the most well-known captures at this time, same year actually, is the Rosetta Stone, captured in a similar way. So yeah, the French were exporting their finds to Alexandria, and the British caught them there, and they held them captive and said, "Give us your statues." And they were reluctant, but they did. The scholars, the French scholars, went to the British Museum with their statues. But yeah, the Rosetta Stone was one of them.
I mean, were they taken off the ships, or like, you know, like transferred from one ship to the other, or you just take the whole ship and the statues?
Great question. I'm not sure of the details of the capture, but yeah.
Thanks a lot to both of you. I have a technical question. I was wondering, what does it take to bring these two very big statues over the sea? Can you describe how they will travel to England?
This, I might have to refer to a colleague in the front row. I know that they have very large crates. So, you know, we'll do, you know, full condition checking. It costs, I can't tell you the exact number, it costs quite a lot of money to send them. So we put them in the crates, and then Angie, do they go by cargo plane or do they go by ship? Yeah. I mean, most art that goes overseas will go in a plane. Things this heavy, I'm not even sure if they would go in the same shipment. They might go in two separate shipments. Some of those logistics are things that we wouldn't get into more than that, but I don't actually know off the top of my head. I do know that we have the crates stored somewhere. And getting them here was an act of some diplomacy. We have letters in our files from Dr. Bryan, like talking about how monumentality and monumental sculpture is such an important part of Egyptian art. And so that it's important to have things like that on view so that our visitors have a sense of that monumentality. And that she knew that the British Museum had more than 30 statues. Most of them were not on view. So we were able to write to them and ask and sort of present our case. And at the time they were willing, and we were more than grateful that they were willing for 20 years for them to stay. So a certain back and forth negotiation is involved, and then other people deal with the more technical aspects, and then the designers come through and decide where are we going to put them. Is the floor capable of holding them up is a very important part of the whole process. We will be able to continue further discussion at the reception upstairs. After the reception, you can also go to the galleries on the second floor to see the Sekhmets again, and you'll be able to come visit them until about July. I just want to say how happy I am that we were able to have this lecture on this topic. Many of you probably know that fall 2022 is a big moment for Egyptology, the 200th anniversary of the decipherment of hieroglyphs a little bit earlier in the fall, and then just a few weeks ago, the 100th anniversary of finding Tutankhamun's tomb. So a lot of focus and interest on Egyptology, and we're really delighted to be able to have this now, and also that you are all able to join us here. So please thank our speakers again, and then join us upstairs.